Mae Ford stepped off the train in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, with a leather satchel in one hand, a folded letter in the other, and a plan so carefully constructed that she had spent the better part of 3 months perfecting it. And within the first 4 minutes of her arrival, every single piece of it began to unravel. She had traveled from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had spent 26 years of her life working in her father's dry goods store, learning the trade, keeping the books, and watching the world move past the window in a way that made her chest ache with a longing she could not quite name. When her father died in the winter of 1881, he left her the store, a modest sum of money saved in a tin box beneath the floorboards, and a letter that he had written years before, which explained that her mother's family had once owned a piece of land outside Caldwell land that had gone untended, unclaimed, and forgotten in the chaos of westward migration. The letter named a solicitor in Caldwell, a man by the name of Arthur Pell, who held the deed in trust. All Mae had to do was go west, meet Arthur Pell, take possession of the deed, sell the land, and use the money to open a dry goods store of her own somewhere civilized and quiet. That was the plan. Arthur Pell had died of a fever the previous October, and nobody in Caldwell seemed to know anything about a deed held in trust, a woman named Mae Ford, or any land outside of town that had gone unclaimed. The clerk at the land registry office, a wiry young man with ink-stained fingers, looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something entirely in a foreign language. "Pell," he repeated. "Arthur Pell." "Yes, ma'am," he passed. His office was cleared out. Most of his files went to the county seat in Wellington, but some of them got water damaged when the roof caved in during the February storm. "I don't know what to tell you." Mae stood on the dusty main street of Caldwell and looked at the folded letter in her hand, then at the satchel at her feet, then at the wide, indifferent sky stretching over the Kansas prairie in every direction, and felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: complete and total disorientation. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. The plan was supposed to work. She found the only hotel in town, a narrow 2-story building called the Prairie House, and paid for a room with money that she was aware she could not afford to spend without a timeline. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was harder than anything she had ever slept on, and laid out what she knew. She had the letter from her father, which described the land but did not include the deed itself. She had the name of a solicitor who was dead. She had no contact at the county seat in Wellington, and she had no way of knowing whether the deed was among the water-damaged files or whether it had survived at all. She would need help. The next morning, Mae dressed carefully, pinned her dark hair under her hat, and went downstairs to the hotel's small dining room, where she intended to ask anyone for advice about where to begin. The dining room was half full of men in work clothes eating eggs and biscuits, and she was the only woman in the room who was not serving the food. She sat at a corner table and ordered coffee, and she was trying to decide who looked the most approachable when the door opened, and a man walked in who immediately drew her attention, not because he was particularly loud or particularly striking, but because of the exact opposite. He was quiet. He moved through the room without making a production of himself, nodding briefly at the man behind the counter, hanging his hat on a peg near the door with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and taking the table beside the window with a kind of settled, unhurried calm that felt unusual in a town that seemed to run on restless energy. He was somewhere around 30, lean but broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the temples. He wore the worn clothing of a working man: plain canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, boots that had seen real miles. But there was something in the way he carried himself that was not quite rough. Careful, maybe. Deliberate. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu, because he clearly already knew what he wanted, and then he unfolded a piece of paper and began reading it with the furrowed concentration of someone working through a problem. Mee watched him for probably longer than was polite, and then made herself look away. She drank half her coffee, turned the situation over in her mind, and then, because she had not come all this way to sit quietly and do nothing, she picked up her cup and moved to the empty chair across from him. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I can see you're occupied, but I'm in a bit of a difficult situation, and I was hoping you might be able to point me towards someone who could help. I don't know many people in Caldwell." He looked up from his paper with the kind of unhurried attention that suggested he was neither startled nor annoyed. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a warm brown, and that there were fine lines at the corners from squinting into the sun. "I might be able to help you myself," he said. "Or at least try, Lionel Carson." He did not offer his hand, which she understood to be correct in a dining room with coffee on the table, but there was something in the directness of his introducing himself that she appreciated. "Mae Ford," she said. "I've come from Ohio. I was supposed to meet a solicitor here named Arthur Pell, but I've just been told he died last year." Something crossed Lionel Carson's face, a brief recognition, quickly assessed. "I knew Arthur Pell," he said. "Not well, but he handled some paperwork for a neighbor of mine a few years back." "What was the nature of your business with him?" she told him. She told him about her father, the tin box, the letter, the land outside Caldwell that her mother's family had once owned. She spread the letter on the table between them and let him read it, because she had already decided that this man, whoever he was the right person to tell. She could not have said exactly why she was so certain of it. Something in the steadiness of him made her trust that he would take her situation seriously rather than dismiss it. He read the letter twice, slowly. Then he sat back and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "The land described here," he said, "I think I know roughly where it is. There's a section northeast of town, out past Fry Creek, that's been sitting empty for years. Nobody's worked it, nobody's built on it. It's not grazing land anyone's claimed as range. It's possible." He paused. "The county records in Wellington are your best starting point. You need the deed. If Pell was holding it in trust and his office was cleared out, those records should have gone to the county clerk in Wellington along with his other files, water damage or not." "How far is Wellington?" "About 30 miles south. A day's ride, half a day in a good wagon." Mee considered this. She could hire a horse, she supposed, though she had not ridden seriously in years and she did not know the road. She could hire a wagon and driver, which would cost money. She could take the train if there was a line running south, which she did not know. "Is there a train?" she asked. "Not to Wellington, not yet." He glanced at the paper in front of him, then folded it deliberately and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm heading south myself day after tomorrow. I have business in a town about 20 miles down and Wellington is on the way. I could take you to the county clerk's office if you can wait 2 days." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" It was a direct question, maybe too direct, but she had learned in 26 years of keeping books that the best way to understand a transaction was to ask plainly what was in it for the other party. He met her directness without flinching. "Because you're a woman traveling alone in a place you don't know, with a legitimate problem that should have a legitimate solution, and it's not far out of my way." A brief pause. "And because Arthur Pell was a decent man and he would have wanted someone to help you if he couldn't." That last part undid something in me that she had not realized was tightly wound. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and said, "2 days, all right. I can wait 2 days." Those 2 days in Caldwell were not idle. Mee was not built for idleness. She went back to the land registry office and asked the ink-fingered clerk to show her every record he had pertaining to the parcel of land her father's letter described, working from the survey map numbers her father had included. The clerk, whose name turned out to be Tobias Wren, was more cooperative on the second visit than the first. Perhaps because Mee came prepared this time with the specific survey language written out on a card, which made her look considerably less like someone who had wandered in off the train with a vague notion. They found a partial record, not the deed, but a reference to it in an older registry book, confirming that the land had been transferred from her grandmother's family, the Holloway family of Ohio, to a trust held by Arthur Pell on behalf of the Ford estate in 1875. It was not enough to prove ownership, but it was enough to prove that the deed existed and that it was legitimate. "You'll need the original deed to make any kind of claim," Tobias Wren said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "But at least now you have something to show the county clerk in Wellington. This reference here," he tapped the page, "should be enough to make them take you seriously." Mae copied out the relevant text in her own hand, carefully and exactly, and tucked it into her satchel next to her father's letter. On the evening of the second day, she was sitting on the small porch of the Prairie house watching the sun turn the Kansas sky into something extraordinary, a broad wash of orange and rose that she had not expected, having grown up under the softer light of Ohio, when Lionel Carson walked past on the far side of the street, leading a roan horse by the bridle. He glanced over and saw her, and he crossed the street with the unhurried stride she was beginning to recognize. "Leaving at first light," he said. "I'll have the wagon out front by 6. Bring what you need." "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "Did you get anywhere with the registry office?" She told him about the partial record, about Tobias Wren, about the reference in the old book. She watched his face as she talked and saw him listening with genuine attention, not the polite half-presence she sometimes got from men who were waiting for her to finish talking. "That's good work," he said. "That's exactly the kind of thing that will make the Wellington clerk take the file seriously." He glanced at the sunset, then back at her. "You figured that out yourself." "I keep books," she said. "I'm used to following a trail backward." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but a softening. "Get some sleep. The road's dry right now, but it gets rough past the creek crossing." He went. Mae watched him until he turned the corner, then looked back at the sunset, which was still doing its best work, and felt something stir in her chest that was entirely different from the longing she had always known before. That old longing was a vague, directional ache. She wanted something, somewhere. She just could not say what or where. This was more specific, more present, more unsettling. She told herself it was simply relief at having found someone useful. She did not entirely believe herself. The wagon left at 6 as promised. It was a working wagon, not a fancy rig, with a bench seat on the front and a flat bed behind loaded with a few crates that Lionel explained belonged to a merchant in the town of Harper, 30 miles south. He was hauling freight on the way down and would pick up a load on the way back. It was, he told her without any particular show of it, how he supplemented his income between seasons. He ran a small cattle operation northeast of Caldwell, a modest herd, nothing grand, with a part-time hand named Deke who watched the place when Lionel was away. "Not what you'd call a prosperous enterprise," he said, watching the road rather than her. "But it's mine." "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "Came west in '74. Was working a ranch near Wichita for a few years, saved enough to buy my own parcel." A pause. "My mother was from a farming family in Missouri. My father died when I was 12. I've been working since I was 12. There was no self-pity in it, just fact stated plainly. Mae found herself liking this about him very much. "My father taught me to keep his books when I was 14, she said. "He said a woman who understood money would never be entirely dependent on anyone. He believed that very strongly." She looked at her hands in her lap. "He was a good man. Practical and kind, which is a rarer combination than people think." "It is," Lionel agreed. They rode in silence for a while, which was not an uncomfortable silence. The prairie opened around them in every direction, vast and green gold in the spring light, with the wind moving through the tall grass in waves that reminded me, unexpectedly, of the surface of the Ohio River on a windy afternoon. She had not expected to find anything beautiful about Kansas. She was revising that expectation steadily. "What will you do if you find the deed?" he asked eventually. "Sell the land," she said. "Use the money to open a dry goods store. That was always the plan." "Where?" I'm not sure anymore." She paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily above the grass far to their right. "I thought somewhere eastern, somewhere with established commerce, but I've been thinking since I got here." She stopped herself. "Thinking what?" He glanced at her briefly. "That maybe the plan I made in Ohio doesn't look the same out here," she said carefully. "That maybe there are other possibilities I hadn't considered." He said nothing to that, but she felt the quality of his attention beside her shift slightly, as though he was turning something over in his mind. They reached Harper in the early afternoon, delivered the crates to the merchant, and pushed on to Wellington by late afternoon. The town was larger than Caldwell, better established, with brick-faced buildings along the main street and a proper courthouse that housed the county clerk's office. Mae went in alone while Lionel watered the horses at a trough down the street, because she wanted to handle this part herself, and she thought he understood that. The county clerk was a meticulous, gray-haired woman named Mrs. Clara Dowd, who took Mae's documents, the original letter, the hand-copied registry reference, and a short statement Mae had written out explaining the chain of custody, and examined them over the top of a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles with the focused attention of someone who took her work seriously. "Arthur Pell's files," Mrs. Dowd said. "Yes, we received them. Most were in poor condition." She set Mae's papers down and rose from her desk, disappearing into a back room that smelled of dust and old paper. Mae sat in the straight-back chair and breathed slowly. She had come a long way. She had remade her plan twice already. She needed this to work. Mrs. Dowd came back 15 minutes later carrying a flat tin box, slightly dented with water staining along one edge. She set it on the desk and opened it. Inside were a number of documents in varying states of damage. Mrs. Dowd sorted through them with practiced hands, and near the bottom of the stack she found it. A folded piece of heavy paper, watermarked at the edges but entirely legible in the body, bearing the official seal of the state of Kansas and the signature of a land commissioner dated 1875. It was the deed. The land at Fry Creek, northeast of Caldwell, 160 acres, held in trust by Arthur Pell on behalf of the estate of Thomas Ford of Cincinnati, Ohio, to be transferred to his heir upon presentation of proper identification and proof of relation. Mae's throat tightened. She produced her identification, a letter from the Cincinnati city clerk confirming her name and her relationship to Thomas Ford, and laid it on the desk. Mrs. Dowd compared the documents carefully. Then she stamped a transfer form, countersigned the deed in the appropriate place, and handed it across the desk with the small, satisfied nod of a woman who appreciated orderly resolution. "The land is yours, Miss Ford," she said. "Congratulations." Mae walked out of the Wellington County Clerk's office holding a deed to 160 acres of Kansas land, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk in the afternoon sun, feeling things she could not immediately sort into coherent thoughts. She had done it. The plan, the original plan, the sell the land plan, was back in play. She had the deed. She could go back to Caldwell, find a buyer, and be on a train east within the month. She looked up and saw Lionel Carson leaning against the side of the wagon across the street, watching her with a quiet expression that gave nothing away. He had brought her here. He had done exactly what he said he would do, and he had done it without making her feel managed or rescued, which was the thing that would have undone her entirely. He had simply been useful and present in the way that a very good person is useful and present when someone needs it. She crossed the street to where he stood. "I got it," she said. The quiet expression shifted into something warmer, and for the first time she saw the real smile, not a polite one, not a careful one, but the full version, which transformed his face into something she had not expected and which hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force that was thoroughly inconvenient. "Good," he said. "I'm glad." They stayed in Wellington that night, Mae at a small hotel near the courthouse, Lionel at a boarding house 2 streets over, and met in the morning to start back north. The return journey felt different from the journey south. Something had shifted. though Mae could not have pinpointed exactly when or how. The silences were easier. The conversation came more freely. She told him about Cincinnati, the gray winters, the river, the way the city was always moving, and she had always felt slightly outside of its movement, watching it from behind the counter of her father's store. He told her about Missouri, about leaving at 20, about the years of working other men's cattle before he had enough saved to work his own. He told her about his one-room cabin northeast of Caldwell, about the way the land looked in the mornings when the light came across the grass, about his roan horse, whose name was Pepper, and whom he described with the kind of specific, fond attention that people usually reserve for people. "You love that horse," she said. "Pepper has better judgment than most men I've met," he said simply. She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he glanced at her sideways with an expression that made her want to say something she was not quite ready to say. They reached Caldwell in the late afternoon of the second day, the sun long and golden across the prairie, the town resolving itself out of the flat horizon with its familiar two-story buildings and its wide main street. Lionel pulled the wagon up in front of the prairie house, and they sat there for a moment without moving, as though neither of them was quite ready to end the journey. "Thank you," Mae said. She meant it with everything she had. "I don't know what I would have done without. You'd have figured it out," he said. "You'd figured out half of it already before I came into it." "Still," she said, "thank you." He climbed down from the wagon and offered her his hand for the step down, and when she took it, his hand warm and calloused against hers, she was aware of him with an intensity that seemed entirely disproportionate to the simple act of stepping off a wagon bench. She let go before she was ready to. "Will you be in town long?" he asked, standing in the street with his hat in his hand. "I'm not sure," she said, and meant it in more ways than he probably understood. She spent the next 3 days in Caldwell asking careful questions about land prices northeast of town. She visited a local land agent named Franklin Greer, a broad, prosperous-looking man who wore his success in his waistcoat and his watch chain, and she sat across his desk and told him plainly what she had and what she wanted to know about its value. He studied the deed, studied the survey description, and told her the land at Fry Creek was worth approximately $800 in the current market, not a fortune but a solid sum. Enough to set up a modest business somewhere, certainly. Enough for the plan she had made in Ohio. "It's good land," Franklin Greer said. "There are buyers. That section near the creek is well watered. A homesteader with some ambition could do something with it." "Who would you recommend as a buyer?" she asked. He named 3 names. One of them was Lionel Carson. Mae sat very still for a moment. "Lionel Carson," she said. "He's been eyeing that section for years," Greer said. "That land would connect to his northern fence line, extend his range significantly. He hasn't had the capital before, but I understand he's had a decent season." Mae thanked Franklin Greer, gathered her papers, and walked out into the bright spring afternoon with the peculiar sensation of the world rearranging itself around her in ways she had not planned and could not entirely control. She did not go looking for Lionel Carson that afternoon. She went back to the hotel and sat at the small desk by the window and tried to think clearly. The situation was straightforward, she told herself. She owned land he wanted to buy. She wanted to sell it. There was nothing complicated about this, except that there was. She thought about what he had said on the road back from Wellington, the way he described the morning light across his land with a quietness that was more eloquent than any fine speech she'd ever heard. She thought about the fact that he'd spent 8 years building something of his own out of nothing, and that the land she was about to sell was the kind of thing that would allow him to build it further. And she thought about the fact that when she tried to picture herself on a train back east with $800 in her satchel, the image felt strangely hollow in a way it had not felt when she was still in Ohio. She was still sitting at the desk when there was a knock at her door. She opened it. Lionel Carson stood in the corridor with his hat in his hand, looking slightly less composed than usual, not much, just enough for her to notice. "I heard you went to see Franklin Greer," he said. "He tells me you might want to buy my land," she said. "I've wanted that section for years," he said. "I didn't know it belonged to anyone. If I'd known it belonged to you." He stopped. "What?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I don't know that I'd change anything about the last week," he said carefully, "but I want you to know that my interest in helping you had nothing to do with the land." "I know that," she said, and she did know it. She had known it from the dining room on the first morning. "Do you want to come in? I have some things I'd like to discuss with you." He came in. She gestured to the chair by the window, which was the only chair in the room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, which had not gotten any softer, and she laid out what she knew in the same way she laid out account books, clearly, systematically, without ornament. "The land is worth $800, she said. "Franklin Greer can find me other buyers. But I'm not certain selling is the right decision anymore." She paused. "I've been thinking about what I said on the road about other possibilities I hadn't considered. I've been in Caldwell for less than 2 weeks and I've already noticed 3 things. 1. There is no dry goods store in this town that carries quality goods. The general store is poorly stocked and overpriced. 2. This town is growing. The railroad has increased traffic significantly. 3. The women in this town have almost nothing to choose from in terms of fabric, household goods, or anything practical. A well-run dry goods store here would do very well." Lionel was watching her with that particular attentive quality she had come to associate with him. "You're thinking of staying," he said. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "If I sell the land, I have capital to start a business. But I'd need to decide where." She looked at him directly. "If you want to buy my land, I'd like to negotiate a fair price. And I'd like to do it knowing that the transaction doesn't affect—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Whatever this is," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Whatever this is," she agreed. The silence in the small hotel room was different from the silences on the road. It had weight and warmth, and a kind of held-breath quality that made me acutely aware of everything around her. The fading afternoon light through the window, the distant sound of the street below, the 6 inches of space between herself on the bed and him in the chair. $750, he said. "I can have it within the month. I'll need to arrange a bank draft." $750, she said. "All right. Me." He said her name with a careful deliberateness as though he had been deciding whether to use it and had decided yes. "If you're thinking of staying in Caldwell, I hope you stay." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I think I might," she said. He left shortly after, and me sat at the window for a long time watching the town settle into evening, and she felt something she recognized from her father's letter, from a passage she had read so many times she could have recited it from memory. He had written about the moment he had met her mother, that he had known in the way you know a true account from a false one, by something solid and certain beneath the surface that did not shift when you pressed it. She had read that passage as a girl and thought it romantic nonsense, and she had read it as a woman of 20 and thought it might be real but probably rare, and she read it now in her own head and felt it land as simple truth. Over the following weeks, as the land sale moved through its proper channels, Lionel's bank draft arranged, the deed transferred, Franklin Greer's paperwork completed with Mrs. Dowd's counterpart in the local registry, made her other arrangements. She found a vacant building on Caldwell's Main Street, a former harness shop whose owner had moved on, and she negotiated a lease with its new owner, a landlord named Oswald Fitch, who charged a fair rent and did not seem surprised that a woman wanted to open a business. Caldwell in 1882 was not yet so refined that it could afford to be surprised by competent women. She wrote to 3 suppliers in Kansas City and 1 in St. Louis, describing what she intended to stock and asking for their terms. She received favorable replies from 2 of them within the week, which confirmed what she had suspected, that Caldwell was underserved enough to represent an attractive new customer for any wholesale supplier worth the name. She also, in the evenings, and on the quieter afternoons when the business of planning allowed it, spent time with Lionel Carson. This was not a dramatic or showy process. It was more like the continuation of what had begun on the road to Wellington conversation that ran from the practical to the personal without ceremony. Silences that were comfortable and easy. The gradual accumulation of small, specific knowledge about each other that constitutes the real architecture of closeness. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar, that he had read more than she would have expected a battered Shakespeare, a worn copy of a history of the Roman Empire, a collection of newspaper editorials on the question of Western land policy that he had strong opinions about. He learned that she kept meticulous lists, that she could be startlingly direct in ways that occasionally shocked the more genteel residents of Caldwell, and that she had a laugh that, once it got going properly, was loud enough to make people at nearby tables turn to look. He seemed to find this last thing particularly delightful. One evening in early June, he took her to see his land. His land, now, the original parcel and the Fry Creek section together, the purchase complete. He rode Pepper and led a steady gray mare named Thistle for her, and they rode north out of town as the afternoon light began to soften. The Fry Creek land was beautiful. That was the first thing she thought, and it surprised her, because she had been thinking of it in terms of surveyor's coordinates and market value. But in the actual evening light, with the creek running clear and chattering over smooth stones along the eastern edge, and the tall grass moving in the warm wind, and the cottonwood trees growing thick along the bank with their leaves turning silver on the underside when the breeze caught them, it was simply beautiful. Lionel sat easy on Pepper and watched her take it in. "Your father was right to hold on to it," he said. "He held on to it for me," she said. "He knew I'd need something to build from. He knew you well. He did." She looked across the grass, across the wide, low sweep of land toward where Lionel's cabin was visible in the middle distance, small against the sky, a thread of smoke rising from the chimney where Deke was presumably making something for his supper. "Did you always want this?" she asked. "Land of your own? A place?" Lionel was quiet for a moment. "When I left Missouri at 20, I didn't know what I wanted," he said. "I just knew I didn't want to be landless and poor for the rest of my life, the way my father was, the way most of the men I grew up around were. The land was the thing that felt real, permanent." He paused. "But the last few years I've had the land and it's been enough and also not quite enough. Does that make sense?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at the land, not at her, and she could study his profile, the clean, quiet lines of it, the set of his jaw, the way the evening light touched the angles of his face without being observed. "Yes," she said. "It makes sense." He turned then and caught her looking, and neither of them looked away. The horses moved gently beneath them, and the creek ran its quiet commentary, and the cottonwood leaves turned silver in the breeze, and Mae Ford felt the full specific weight of what was happening between them and decided that she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Lionel," she said. "Me," he said. They looked at each other for another long moment, and then she said, "I'm staying in Caldwell." "I know," he said. "I'm not staying because of you," she said carefully. "The business makes sense here. I've done the numbers, I've assessed the market, and it is genuinely the best location for what I want to build." "I know that too," he said, and his voice was even but warm. "You're not the kind of woman who makes a practical decision for impractical reasons." "But," she said, "I would be lying if I pretended that staying in Caldwell had nothing to do with you." The smile came, the real one, the full one, and it did the same thing to her chest that it had done outside the Wellington County Clerk's office, but more so, because this time she was not surprised by it. This time she had been waiting for it. "Good," he said, "because I would be lying if I pretended I wasn't hoping you'd stay." Yes. On the ride back to Caldwell that evening, with the stars beginning to show in the eastern sky and the last of the sunset still burning in the west, Lionel's hand found hers where it rested on the saddle horn, and he held it lightly for a few minutes without saying anything, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and that was how it began properly. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell was hot and brilliant and full. Mae's store opened in July under the name Ford's Dry Goods, and within 2 weeks it was the busiest commercial establishment on the main street except for the saloon, which had an unfair structural advantage. She had stocked it with an eye for what the women of the town actually needed: quality fabric in colors that were not all brown, sensible household goods, good thread, needles that did not break after 3 uses, writing paper, ink, boots in women's sizes, and the response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Women who had been driving 30 miles to Wichita for particular items came to Mae's store instead. Women who had been making do with inferior goods found that they did not have to. Mae worked 6 days a week and loved every minute of it. On Sunday afternoons, when the store was closed and the town took its collective breath, she drove out to Lionel's place on the roan mare he had insisted she borrow permanently, which she had accepted because she had done the arithmetic on buying her own horse, and it did not yet make financial sense, and which she was aware was also partly because the horse gave her a reason to be out at his place regularly, which was a transparent fiction that they both recognized and neither of them mentioned. She learned the land the way she had learned her father's account books, by going over it methodically, by asking questions, by paying attention. She learned where the best grass grew and where the soil turned sandy and unreliable. She learned the names of the neighboring homesteaders, the Reardon family to the west, the Gutierrez family to the south, good people who had been working their section since 1878 and who were kind to her in the direct, practical way of people, who judged new arrivals by their willingness to work rather than by where they had come from. She met Deke, who was a wiry, weathered man of about 50 with a dry sense of humor and no apparent interest in making conversation beyond what was strictly necessary, and who watched her with a careful assessment for the first 2 weeks before appearing at the door of the cabin one morning and handing her a cup of coffee without being asked, which she understood to be his version of approval. She also learned Lionel more fully. She learned that he was a man who expressed himself more easily in action than in words, that his care for her was visible in the small, specific attentions he paid without commentary, the way he had the mare ready when she arrived, the way he checked without asking whether she had eaten before a long ride, the way he read the section of the newspaper that covered Eastern commerce and set it aside for her without mentioning that he had done so. She learned that he was genuinely fair in his dealings with everyone, with Deke, with his neighbors, with the people he traded with in town, and that this was not performed goodness, but the actual texture of how he moved through the world. She learned that he had opinions about things that mattered, about the land rights of the Plains Indians, whose dispossession he spoke of with a plain-spoken anger that she respected, about the treatment of the Mexican ranching families who had been pushed off their ancestral land by legal maneuvers she found genuinely monstrous when he described them. He did not make grand speeches about these things. He simply said what he thought, clearly and directly, and then went on about his business. She found this tremendously attractive. She was in his cabin one August evening helping him go over his accounts. She had offered this because the state of his record-keeping was, in her professional assessment, a small catastrophe, and because the offer of practical help was more natural to her than any other form of expression, when he set down his pen and looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen from him before, more open, more uncertain, more like the inside of him than the composed exterior she had come to know. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I mean it seriously, and that if the answer is no, I will accept that and will go on as we are." Her pen was still in her hand, poised over a column of figures. She set it down deliberately and gave him her full attention. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you if you'll marry me," he said. "Not because of the land or the business or any practical reason. Because I love you, Mae. I've been in love with you since somewhere between Caldwell and Wellington, and every day since has made it more certain. You're the finest person I've met in my life, and I want to build something with you. Not just alongside each other, together." Mae looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the table between them cast a warm circle of light across his account books, across her hands, across his face, open and careful and waiting. Outside, The Kansas night was immense and alive, crickets and the distant movement of cattle and the wind in the grass. She thought about the plan she had made in Cincinnati, the careful, practical plan that had fallen apart within 4 minutes of her arrival in Caldwell. She thought about the way she had sat in the Prairie House dining room and chosen his table, and why she had chosen it, and how she had not been wrong about him for a single moment since. She thought about what her father had written in his letter about her mother, the solid, certain feeling of a true account. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you. I love you too, Lionel. I have for a long time." He exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for quite a while, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side, and he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her heart turn over completely, and he kissed her. And it was nothing like a first kiss in the formal sense, because they had been building toward this for months with every mile of road and every conversation and every Sunday afternoon ride across the grass. So it felt instead like an arrival, like a door finally opened to a room she had always known was there. They married in September, at the small white church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a morning when the prairie was beginning to show its fall colors, the grass going golden and russet, the cottonwoods along Fry Creek turning a clear bright yellow against the blue sky. Mae wore a dress she had made herself from the finest fabric in her own store, a deep blue wool that she had set aside for this purpose, the moment she admitted to herself where things were going, and which she had sewn in the evenings over several weeks, carrying the ongoing work of it like a private conversation with her own future. The wedding was attended by Deke, who wore a clean shirt and shook Lionel's hand with what appeared to be genuine emotion before looking extremely uncomfortable about having displayed it. The Reardon family came, all 6 of them, the children scrubbed and formal. The Gutierrez family came, and Rosa Gutierrez cried in a warm, unashamed way that made me feel entirely welcome. Tobias Wren from the land registry attended with his young wife. Franklin Greer came. Mrs. Dowd from Wellington had sent a letter of congratulation that Mae kept in her satchel. The minister, a bespectacled young man named Reverend Hatch, who had come west from Pennsylvania 2 years before, and had not yet entirely adjusted to the scale of the sky, read the vows in a slightly trembling voice that Mae suspected was nerves rather than sentiment. She and Lionel stood facing each other and said the words with steadiness and complete attention, and when it was done and he kissed her in the sight of everyone present, Deke cleared his throat so loudly that several children laughed, which broke the solemnity beautifully. The celebration afterward was at the store, which Mae had closed for the day and decorated with autumn flowers from Rosa Gutierrez's garden. There was food brought by everyone: Rosa's tamales, which were the finest thing Mae had eaten since arriving in Kansas, Mrs. Reardon's dried apple pie, bread from the baker down the street who had quietly become one of Mae's most loyal customers. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a second fiddle. By evening, the main street in front of Ford's Dry Goods was full of people dancing, including Deke, who turned out to be surprisingly skilled, which he pretended not to know. Mae danced with Lionel until the stars were fully out above Caldwell, and then they stood together at the edge of the light with his arm around her shoulders and her hand on his chest over his heartbeat, and she looked up at the sky, that vast, improbable Kansas sky, and felt the settled, complete happiness of a person who has found the thing they were always going to find, even when they were not looking for it. The autumn deepened into winter. Mae ran the store with increasing efficiency and increasing joy. She had hired a young woman named Jenny Marsh, 17 and clever, who was quickly learning the work and who had an instinctive talent for the fabric and textile side of the trade that Mae nurtured deliberately, because she recognized in Jenny the same quality her father had recognized in her, a mind that worked well with numbers and systems, waiting to be given a proper use. Jenny's family had come to Kansas from Tennessee 3 years earlier, and they were good people working a hard claim south of town, and Mae paid Jenny a fair wage that made a real difference to the family's winter. Life at the cabin northeast of town was different from what Mae had imagined her domestic life would look like from her perspective in Cincinnati. Rougher in some ways, richer in others. The cabin was small and plain, and winter in Kansas was not the soft gray Ohio winter she knew, but a hard, bright, wind-driven thing that rattled the windows and piled snow against the door. But there was a wood stove that threw serious heat, and there were evenings when the snow made the world outside quiet and blue-white, and she sat across the table from Lionel reading or working on accounts while he read or sharpened tools or went over his own plans for the spring expansion of the herd. And the warmth of the room and the lamplight and his presence across the table was the most complete contentment she had ever known. She told him this once in plain language, and he looked up from his book and said, "I feel exactly the same," without elaboration, which she found was exactly enough. That first winter, an unexpected thing happened that changed the shape of things further. A woman named Celeste Ruiz arrived in Caldwell in November, alone, speaking primarily Spanish, with a small daughter named Lupe, aged 5, and almost nothing else. She had been traveling from New Mexico territory, following a route her husband had been supposed to travel before he died of a fever in Albuquerque in September, and she was trying to reach cousins in Wichita. She ran out of money in Caldwell, and the only person in town she dared approach was the woman at the dry goods store, whose hired girl had greeted her with warmth rather than suspicion. Mae spoke no Spanish and Celeste spoke limited English, but Mae had a gift for the language of practical need that transcended specific vocabulary, and within an hour of Celeste's arrival at the store she had established the main facts, found Celeste and Lupe a warm room at the Prairie House, arranged for meals, and written a letter to the Rosa Gutierrez, who arrived that afternoon to speak with Celeste properly and translate what was needed. The cousins in Wichita were contacted. They were real and willing to receive Celeste and Lupe. The problem was the journey. Lionel arranged it. He knew a freighter making the run north who owed him a favor, and he secured Celeste and Lupe a safe, accompanied passage to Wichita at no cost, and gave Celeste a small amount of money from his own pocket for necessities when she arrived, which he mentioned to me only when it was done. Mae looked at him when Rosa translated what he had done, and Celeste composed and dignified throughout her ordeal in a way that Mae enormously admired. Went to Lionel and spoke quietly in Spanish. Rosa translated. She was saying that he was a good man and that she would pray for his family's health and happiness as long as she lived. Lionel received this with a slight color in his face and the contained look of a man who was moved but did not wish to make it about himself, and Mae loved him so specifically in that moment that she had to look away to compose herself. Celeste and Lupe departed for Wichita 2 days later, and Mae thought about them often afterward, hoped for them, was glad that the world had people like Rosa Gutierrez in it who could bridge the gaps that might otherwise leave a woman and her child stranded and alone. She also thought that winter about the injustice of a world that left so many people stranded and alone not by accident, but by design, about the families she saw passing through Caldwell, dispossessed from lands their families had worked for generations, Native and Mexican families in particular, displaced by laws and violence that were dressed up in the language of progress and civilization, but were, when you looked plainly at them, neither. She talked to Lionel about this, and they talked to the Gutierrez family about it, and they did what small things they could within the limits of their ordinary lives: fair dealing, fair wages, fair witness to the facts, which was not enough, and they knew it was not enough, but it was the real thing rather than nothing. Spring returned to Caldwell in 1883 with its extraordinary sky and its wind and its wide, bright green reopening of the world. The herd had wintered well. The store had turned a solid profit in its first full season, and Mae was already planning the expansion. A second room at the back for hardware and farm supplies, which there was clear demand for, and which would require a trip to Kansas City to establish the necessary wholesale relationships. A trip she was looking forward to with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been confined to a 30-mile radius for the better part of a year. And in April of 1883, Mae told Lionel she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the spring light coming through the window and the smell of coffee in the air, and she watched him absorb it, the full, particular surprise of it, even though it was not entirely unexpected. And then the expression that followed was one she had not seen from him before, but which she recognized immediately as something fundamental. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with such clear, full love that her eyes filled without her permission. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was the first thing he needed to know. "Yes," she said. "I feel very well. A little tired in the mornings, but—" He came around the table and put his arms around her and held her carefully, the way you hold something precious, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel everything, the joy and the nervousness and the extraordinary weight of the future taking shape. "I never thought," he began and stopped. "Neither did I," she said. "Not exactly like this." Their son was born in November of 1883 in the cabin northeast of Caldwell, with a midwife named Mrs. Agnes Laughlin attending, and Rosa Gutierrez keeping me company through the long hours of the night before, which was the kind of friendship that makes a woman feel that she is, finally, genuinely home. Lionel stayed as close as he was permitted, which was not very close for most of it, and Deke apparently spent the entire night sharpening tools in the barn, which was his way of being present. The baby was named James Thomas Carson James for Lionel's father, Thomas for Mae's. He was born healthy and loud, with a wrinkled, furious face that gave way very quickly to an expression of intense interest in everything around him, which Mae felt was appropriate. Lionel held him for the first time with the concentrated, careful attention of a man holding something he is afraid of breaking, and then his face went completely soft in a way Mae had not seen before and which she stored carefully in the best part of her memory. "James Thomas," he said quietly. "Hello." James Thomas Carson opened his eyes, which were the dark, unfocused blue of all newborns but which would eventually become the warm brown of his father's, and looked in the general direction of Lionel's voice with that expression of fierce New World interest, and Lionel made a sound that was mostly a breath and entirely love. "He looks like you," Mae said. "He looks like himself," Lionel said. Over the next years, Caldwell grew and changed, and Mae's store grew with it. She expanded into hardware and farm supplies as planned, hired 2 more staff members, and established relationships with suppliers in Kansas City that brought quality goods to the region at prices that were fair by any measure. She became, without particularly intending to, one of the most respected businesswomen in the territory, not because she sought influence but because she did her work well and treated people fairly, and did not pretend to be less than she was, which in Caldwell in the 1880s was still somewhat unusual for a woman but was becoming less so as the town matured. Jenny Marsh had grown into a capable young woman who was effectively managing the fabric and textile side of the store by 1885, and Mae was paying her a proper wage that reflected this. Jenny's father had told me, at the harvest gathering that year, that Jenny was talking about opening her own shop someday, and Mae had told him that she was glad to hear it, and that if Jenny ever needed advice or help, she had only to ask. She felt about this the same way she imagined her father had felt about her, the particular satisfaction of passing something forward. James Carson grew from an intensely curious baby into an intensely curious small boy who followed his father around the ranch with focused determination, and followed his mother around the store with equal determination, and who by the age of 3 had strong opinions about the arrangement of goods on the lower shelves, which Mae found alternately charming and alarming. He had Lionel's quiet steadiness and Mae's directness, and the combination produced a child of remarkable composure and occasional startling bluntness. In the spring of 1886, when James was 2.5 and spending a great deal of time trying to convince Pepper to allow him to sit on her back, which Pepper permitted with a patience that suggested Lionel had been right about the horse's superior judgment. Mae was pregnant again. This time she told Lionel in the evening, sitting on the porch of the cabin in the warm spring dusk with James asleep inside and the prairie going dark and silver around them. Lionel was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to look at her with an expression that held all of the same things it had held the first time: love and joy and the careful weight of responsibility, but easier now, more settled, because they had done this once and they knew each other as partners in a way that was deeper than it had been before. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. He leaned over and kissed her temple, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the spring night listening to Kansas breathe. Their daughter, Clara Holloway Carson, Clara for Mrs. Clara Dowd in Wellington, who had handed me her deed on the day everything changed, and Holloway for me's mother's family, whose land had become the root of everything, was born in October of 1886, smaller than James had been, with lungs that were immediately and emphatically larger. She was healthy and furious about being born, and she settled into calm only when Lionel held her against his chest, which he found so moving that Deke, who was outside on the porch, heard the silence and came to the door and asked if everything was all right, and Mae from the bed said, "He's just holding his daughter for the first time," and heard Deke say something that might have been "oh," and then heard him sit back down on the porch step without another word. James, upon being introduced to Clara the following morning, studied her with concentrated 2.5-year-old seriousness and said, "She's very small," which was accurate. He adapted to her existence with the equanimity of a child who had grown up watching his parents navigate things by being straightforward about them. The years moved on in the way that good years move, not slowly or quickly but fully, each one distinct and complete, like the landscape scene from a moving wagon where you can look back and see clearly where you have been. Caldwell grew into a substantial town. The railroad extended its reach. New families arrived and the old ones put down deeper roots. The Gutierrez family expanded their operation, and their eldest son, Marco, became one of Lionel's most trusted business contacts. The Reardon family's middle daughter married a young man from the East who reminded me of herself in 1882, freshly arrived, bewildered by the scale of the sky, full of plans that would require adjusting. Lionel's cattle operation grew steadily. By 1888, he had a proper ranch house, not grand, but solid and well-built, with enough rooms for the family and a real study where Mae could keep her accounts for both the store and the ranch, which she managed together with the systematic pleasure of a woman who genuinely loved a well-ordered ledger. He had expanded the herd, taken on 2 full-time hands in addition to the permanent Deke, and was selling cattle regularly to buyers in Wichita and Kansas City. The Fry Creek section, the land from her mother's family, was now the heart of his range, the water from the creek making the grass consistently good in a way that the sections further from the water could not match. Mae thought often about the chain of events that had led to this: her father's letter, Arthur Pell's death, the clerk at the Wellington County seat with water-damaged files, Lionel Carson in the dining room of the Prairie House with his hat on its peg, and his paper on the table, and his quality of settled quiet that had made her pick up her coffee cup and cross the room. She thought about how fragile the chain was, how easily any link could have been different, and she felt the weight of the luck in it without taking it for granted. She also did not, in her more honest private moments, entirely think of it as luck. She had gotten on the train. She had come west despite the difficulty of it. She had walked into that dining room and chosen his table rather than anyone else's. She had done the work with Tobias Wren. She had asked Mrs. Dowd for what she needed. She had made herself a new plan when the first one failed, and then another one, and then she had opened a store and run it well and stayed in a place where she had no reason to stay except the best one. Her father had said that a woman who understood money would never be entirely dependent on anyone. He had been right. But he had also written, in the same letter that told her about the Kansas land, about the solid, certain feeling of a true account. She thought now that both things were true, that you needed to be able to stand on your own, and that the standing was better when you were standing beside someone worth standing beside. In the summer of 1889, James was 5 years old and already helping in the way of 5-year-olds, which was to say with tremendous enthusiasm and limited practical effect. Clara was 2.5 and absolutely certain about everything. Mae was pregnant for the 3rd time, which she discovered in June, and which she told Lionel about one morning over the account books, looking up from the column she was working on and simply saying, "I'll need to hire someone additional to cover for me in the fall." He looked up from the survey map he was studying, looked at her, understood immediately. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," she said. "The same as before, tired in the mornings." He set down the survey map and came around the table in the way she had come to know so well, that unhurried, deliberate movement. And he sat beside her on the bench and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the morning light coming through the window of their study, the account book spread open in front of them and the Kansas summer pressing its warmth against the glass. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "We'll need to extend the east room," he said practically. "We will," she said. "I'll draw it up." He turned and kissed her properly, unhurried, the kind of kiss that existed for its own sake rather than as a prelude to anything else, and she returned it with the same quality of attention, and for a moment there was nothing else in the world but the two of them in the summer morning, with everything they had built together around them and the future already arriving. Their second son was born in late November of 1889. He was named William Deke Carson William because they both liked the name, and Deke for his unofficial godfather, who received this news with the longest sustained silence he had ever produced, and then cleared his throat approximately 4 times in rapid succession and went to check on the horses. William was born healthy and with a disposition that suggested from the earliest days a gentler temperament than either of his siblings, quieter, watchful, with a tendency to observe the world rather than address it immediately, which Mae found she recognized. "He's like you," she told Lionel. "He's himself," Lionel said, which was what he always said, but with the warmth of someone who was not entirely displeased by the observation. Caldwell in the early 1890s was a different place from the Caldwell Mae had arrived in 1882. The cattle trade that had made the town was shifting. The open range era was ending, fenced ranges becoming the standard, the long drives giving way to more settled ranching patterns. Towns like Caldwell were finding new identities. Some struggled. Caldwell, with its railroad connection and its established merchant community, was adapting well, but the change was real and it required adjustment. Mae's store expanded again. She took the adjacent building when it became available in 1890 and broke through the shared wall to create a larger, better organized establishment that she reorganized from top to bottom with the thoroughness of someone who had been mentally redesigning it for years. The expansion allowed her to add a section she had wanted since the early days, a small selection of books, newspapers, and stationery, which brought in a different class of customer, and which she found personally satisfying in the way that all the practical sections of the store were not quite. Lionel adapted to the changing cattle trade with the same pragmatic intelligence he brought to everything. He shifted more of his operation toward beef cattle for the rail market, reduced his dependence on the long drive routes that were becoming obsolete, and brought on Marco Gutierrez as a formal business partner in 1891, a decision that was both financially sound and personally right in a way that made me proud of him every time she thought about it. James, at 7, had decided that he was going to be a rancher. Clara, at 5, had decided that she was going to run the store. William, at 2, had not yet decided anything except that the cat was interesting. Mae recorded all of this in the journal she had kept since arriving in Caldwell, writing each child's pronouncements with the same care she kept accounts, because she believed that a life well recorded was a life better understood. She also recorded the ordinary things, the quality of the light on the prairie in various seasons, the conversations with Lionel that she did not want to forget, the dinners with the Gutierrez family, the Sunday afternoons riding out with Lionel across the Fry Creek section, while whoever was available watched the children, the particular sound the wind made in the cottonwoods along the creek in autumn, which she loved with a specificity that would have surprised her 1882 self. That woman who had stepped off the train with her plan had not expected to love this land. She had come to take what it offered and go back east, and instead the land had offered her something she had not known to include in any plan, a home, in the fullest possible sense of that word. In the spring of 1892, on a Sunday afternoon in May when the prairie was at its most extravagant green, Mae and Lionel rode out to the Fry Creek section together, just the two of them. The children were at the ranch house with Deke, who had become, despite himself, entirely devoted to all three of them. They rode along the creek bank in the afternoon sun, the cottonwoods fully leafed out and the water running high and clear from the spring snowmelt. They stopped at the same place they had stopped on that first evening 10 years before, when he had brought her out to see the land, and the real smile had transformed his face, and she had looked at it with the held-breath feeling of someone standing at a beginning. They sat their horses in the afternoon light, which was the same gold and honey light it had always been in this place, and Mae thought about 10 years in a way she did not always allow herself, not the individual days which she knew well enough, but the long arc of it, the shape it made. "What are you thinking?" Lionel asked. She looked at him, his face known so completely now, every line of it, the gray at his temples that had begun to appear in the last year, the warm brown eyes, the quality of attention he always gave her that was the thing she had recognized and trusted from the beginning. "I'm thinking about the plan I made in Cincinnati," she said. "The one that fell apart within 4 minutes of my arriving here." He smiled. "The land, the deed, sell it, go home. That was the plan," she said. "It was a perfectly good plan." "It wasn't the right plan," he said. "No," she agreed. "The right plan turned out to be the one I made after it fell apart. The one that included staying in Caldwell and opening a store," and she paused, "and the man who helped me start making it." He looked at her with that expression she had loved for 10 years, settled and warm and entirely present. "I'm glad I was at the right table in the right dining room at the right time," he said. "I'm glad I picked up my coffee and crossed the room," she said. They sat there for a while in the May light, the creek running its quiet line below them, the cottonwoods moving in the warm wind, the vast Kansas sky doing its inexhaustible work above the grass. Then Lionel reached over, the way he had on the road back from Wellington a decade ago, and found her hand, and she turned her hand to hold his back. "James wants to start working the south pasture this summer," Lionel said presently, in the easy way that conversation resumed between people who know each other well. "He's 7. I think he's ready for some real responsibility." "Give it to him," Mae said. "He'll surprise you. Clara wants to come to the store on Saturdays." "I know. I've been letting her arrange the fabric bolts. Her organization system is eccentric, but she defends it with extraordinary conviction. That's her mother." Mae laughed, the real laugh, the loud one that made him smile every time he heard it. The sound of it crossed the creek and came back from the far bank slightly changed, the way things do when they travel and return, and the afternoon held it for a moment before the wind moved on. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not a nervous question. It was the question of a man who already knew the answer but wanted to hear it said. She looked around her, at the land that had begun everything, at the man who had helped her make a life from a fallen-apart plan, at the Kansas sky that had astonished her and continued to astonish her every clear morning when she stepped outside and felt the scale of it. She thought of her children at the ranch house, of the store on Caldwell's Main Street with its window display and its good stock and its steady business, of 10 years of evenings over account books and 10 years of Sunday afternoons and 10 years of a man who listened when she talked and said what he thought and held her with the careful attention of someone who understood what they were holding. "Yes," she said. "It came out simply and completely, the way true things do. I'm very happy, Lionel." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it, a gesture she had not expected the first time he had done it years ago, and which still made her breath catch, then held it against his chest the way she sometimes held his hand against her own heartbeat when words were not quite enough. They rode back to the ranch house in the gold of the late afternoon, easy and unhurried, the horses knowing the way. When they came into the yard, Deke was sitting on the porch with William on his knee, and a look of elaborate discomfort that told her William had been talking at length about something. James was visible in the paddock, talking seriously to Pepper, who was listening with her characteristic dignified attention. Clara came running from the barn the moment she heard the horses, her dark hair loose from its braid and her expression communicating that something important had happened that required immediate parental attention. "Papa," Clara said, arriving at Lionel's stirrup before his horse had fully stopped. "Deke said that I was not allowed to rearrange the tack room, but I think the arrangement was inefficient and I made it better." Lionel looked at Deke over Clara's head. Deke looked back with an expression of pure long-suffering that he wore exclusively around Clara. "Did you move the good saddle?" Lionel asked Clara. "I put it in a better place," Clara said firmly. "Show me," Lionel said, dismounting. Clara took his hand and led him toward the barn with the confident stride of someone who has been entirely right about something and is about to prove it. Me watched them go, this man and this daughter, and felt the complete, unhurried joy of it move through her like warmth from a good fire. She dismounted and went to take William from Deke, who relinquished him with what appeared to be relief. "What was he talking to you about?" she asked Deke quietly. "Horses," Deke said. "Specifically Pepper's feelings about various subjects. He has theories." "He's 2.5. He has very detailed theories," Deke said. James appeared at her elbow, having concluded his conversation with Pepper. He was 7 years old and serious in the way his father was serious, not grave exactly, but attending. He looked up at her. "How was the ride?" he asked. "It was good," Me said. "The creek is very high. The cottonwoods are out." He nodded, taking this in. "Deke said I could feed the horses tonight," he said. "He said if I did it right, maybe this summer I could start learning to mend fences." "That sounds like a fair arrangement," Me said. He nodded again, satisfied, and went to start his evening work with the focused purposefulness of a boy who had grown up watching two people build something with their hands and their heads and their consistent, honest effort, and who had absorbed from this, in the particular way children absorb the things that matter most, that this was how a life was made, not by a single plan, but by being willing to make another one when the first one fell apart, and paying attention to who is beside you when you do. From inside the barn, Me could hear Clara's voice explaining her tack room system to Lionel in the rapid, certain way she explained everything, and Lionel's voice responding with questions that were real questions, not the patronizing kind, the kind that meant he was actually listening. She could hear Pepper moving quietly in her stall. She could hear the cottonwood at the edge of the yard turning its leaves in the evening wind. She held her youngest son on her hip and looked at the sky, that extraordinary, inexhaustible Kansas sky, going orange and rose and gold in the west the way it always did, the way it had done on her very first evening in this country, when she had sat on the porch of the Prairie House with her failed plan and her leather satchel, and had not yet known what was waiting for her on the other side of it. She thought of her father, who had kept a tin box under the floorboards and believed that a woman who understood money would never be entirely dependent on anyone. He had been right about the money. He had also been right about the land, and right about the letter, and right about something he had written once about the solid, certain feeling of a true account. She hoped, wherever he was, that he could see how his foresight had traveled from Cincinnati to Caldwell, from a tin box to 160 acres along Fry Creek, from a plan made in Ohio to a life made in Kansas that was, by every measure she knew how to apply, exactly right. The evening settled around the Carson ranch like something you could hold, the warm, specific peace of people and animals and land that have come to know each other, the ordinary miracle of a day ending well and a life making sense. Lionel came out of the barn with Clara still talking, and he met Mae's eyes across the yard with the look they exchange sometimes in the good moments, not sentimental, not demonstrative, just the clear, direct recognition of two people who understand exactly what they have. She smiled. He smiled back. William patted her face with one small hand, announcing something important in the limited vocabulary of the very young. "I know," Mae told him. "I see it too." The stars came out above Caldwell, one by one and then all at once, filling the Kansas dark with their tremendous indifferent light, and the Carson family went inside for supper, and the cottonwoods along Fry Creek spoke quietly to each other in the evening wind, and the land that had started everything lay under the stars exactly as it always had, patient, generous, holding the deep roots of everything that grew from it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.